Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mosaic's second of two webinars regarding the legal needs of human trafficking survivors. I'm Zoe Root, the lead attorney on the Mosaic's initiative, which is dedicated to providing training and technical assistance to court practitioners on how to best identify and assist survivors of sex and labor trafficking who are facing criminal charges. Mosaics is a project of the School of Public Affairs at American University and is funded by a grant from the Office for Victims of Crime. We are thrilled to have Marianna Kosharovsky and Megan Lundstrom with us again today. Marianna is the founder and executive director of ALIGHT. ALIGHT exists to connect, empower, and build the international anti-trafficking community to more efficiently represent the rights of trafficking victims and survivors. Megan is a member of Mosaic's Training and Advisory Board and the co-founder and director of research at the Avery Center. The Avery Center for Research and Services is dedicated to economic empowerment of survivors of domestic sex trafficking and specializes in programming and advocacy in rural areas. Due to the complexity of human trafficking, survivors often have multiple interlocking legal needs that negatively affect their ability to achieve stability and escape the trafficking cycles. Survivors need specialized services that can assist with expungement, vacatur, and record sealing. Beyond criminal records, survivors often face other legal obstacles such as debt, identity theft, and lack of child custody. In part one of our Legal Needs Workshop series, Megan and Marianna discussed the findings of the Legal Deserts Report and what it reveals about the landscape of legal services available to human trafficking survivors, including specific case studies on how the lack of services harms individual survivors, as well as opportunities for legal professionals to shift the tide and provide meaningful assistance to survivors. During today's webinar, Megan and Marianna will continue to discuss the findings of the Legal Deserts Report, namely specific areas of survivors' legal needs, gaps in the provision of appropriate legal services, and additional opportunities for legal services organizations to meet the needs of survivors. A few technical points about the format of this webinar before we get started. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded. If you have questions at any time, feel free to type them into the chat box, and provided that there is time at the end, I will read out the questions for our panelists to answer. Finally, there's a tab on the right-hand side of your screen called Handouts. There you will find a copy of the Legal Deserts Report, as well as several other handouts provided by our panelists. So before I hand it over to Megan and Marianna, I'd like to administer two poll questions to get a sense of who is in this virtual room with us here today. So Steve, if you could please administer the first poll question. So the question for all of you to answer, and please feel free to check the box as soon as the answer occurs to you, is: have you encountered human trafficking survivors with legal needs? Please select either yes, no, or I don't know to the question, have you encountered human trafficking survivors with legal needs? We'll give you all a couple more seconds to answer that question, and you'll be able to see the results momentarily. All right, so 93% of you have in fact encountered human trafficking survivors with legal needs. 7% of you have not encountered human trafficking survivors with legal needs, and none of you are not sure whether or not you have. So the next question we have for everyone. Steve, if you could pull it up, great, thank you. So for those of you who previously answered yes, so for the 93% of you who said yes, you have encountered survivors with legal needs, were you able to meet those legal needs? So if you answered no before, please do not answer this question. Please only answer this question if you answered yes, you have encountered human trafficking survivors with legal needs. And the question is, were you able to meet those legal needs? Your answer options are yes, no, or I don't know.
We'll close the poll in about 15 seconds, so if you haven't answered, please feel free to do so now.
All right, so of those of you who previously answered yes, that you have encountered survivors of human trafficking with legal needs, your answers to were you able to meet those legal needs were 50% of you said yes, you were able to meet their legal needs. 38% of you are sure that you are not able to meet that survivor's legal needs. And 13% of you said you don't know whether you were able to meet the legal needs of the human trafficking survivor you were serving. Thank you all so much for participating in that poll. It is really helpful for us to have a sense of who is here and what type of issues you are encountering and what sorts of struggles you encounter in meeting the legal needs of human trafficking survivors. With that, I will hand it over to Megan and Marianna, who will begin us on our presentation.
We're having some technical difficulties, so give us 1 sec.
Of course.
Let's see. Zoe, do I have the ability to share the screen from mine?
Let me.
I just gave you control, Megan.
Do I have the ability to limit what's on my screen? I am so not familiar with this platform.
You and the rest of us, Megan.
Looks great. And so just click present. Perfect. Are you able to hear both of us?
Yes, I can hear you, Marianna.
Okay, there we go.
Great.
There we go. Thank you everyone for your patience. And welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Marianna Kosharovsky, and Megan Lundstrom deftly stepped in to save the day. We are so delighted to be presenting the second workshop in the series. Welcome to those who were with us for the first one and to the ones that are new, and looking forward to diving in to some of the legal problems of survivors. The reason that Megan and I are co-presenting is that we are both deeply and historically concerned with the need to address the pervasive gaps in services, and happy to share our unique partnership, which we have had in place, I think, since 2017, which every year feels longer and longer, but amazing. Both our organizations, the Avery Center and ALIGHT, had started out very locally in our Colorado communities before they respectively had gone national, and we've been working together since that time. because of our on-the-ground work with survivors, we continually heard how they do not have access to legal services, at the same time as the fact that their exploitation had many impacts and consequences on their lives going forward for years and years. So we were concerned that survivors were being left out of traditional services, and started working together to see how we could provide non-traditional services in a way, non-traditional in the sense that we want to be more flexible and survivor-centric to make sure that we're really helping survivors with their on-the-ground concerns. And I know Megan has maybe a similar, maybe a slightly different version on our work together.
Yeah, very similar. I do remember meeting Marianna, and as a survivor myself, knowing that I had my own criminal record. I had been criminalized as a part of my exploitation. And I, previous to meeting Marianna, had kind of just thought this was going to be, the way things are as a survivor. And so when I first met Marianna and learned about ALIGHT, I was very intrigued with this because I knew firsthand just the barriers that having a criminal record can create for survivors in terms of finding housing, accessing education, finding stable living wage employment, all of these things. And but I also was very hesitant because I had interacted with not a ton of agencies at that time, but the ones that I had, and had felt kind of discouraged about the promises that were made, but the follow through just wasn't there for one reason or another. So when I first met Marianna, I was like, I'll try ALIGHT and see how it goes before I decide if this is something that the Avery Center would like to collaborate with ALIGHT, and if it's something that we can assist connecting our clients to. So I went through ALIGHT's process and was able to successfully get my record sealed here in Colorado, where I live. And that was such an empowering experience. And the attorney that walked me through that was just incredible. And so since that time, Marianna and I have had just an ongoing relationship because we see this being such an important service and need for survivors. And also, as Marianna said, just realizing survivors' voices are oftentimes not centered in this work. And we both feel very passionately about making sure survivors feel heard, and that when we're advocating for our needs, that this field is working to meet those needs, however that might look.
Yes, we want this for more people, and hopefully we can enlist you in that help. And so our agenda, which is the next slide, will be to address some of the complexities specifically that we see survivors face, launch into some of the dynamics of legal representation that we all have to be aware of, share findings from reports and survivor voices, and then go into next steps. And so for the next slide, to talk high level about the survivor's complex legal needs. These legal needs are complex because our legal system is complex, and also because of the unique challenges facing survivors. And so even when we are working on nuts and bolts, discrete, simple legal issues at once, we have to realize that on its own, that could be overwhelming for survivors to navigate, just to have to interact with the legal system, which we will actually address in detail. But the multiple legal needs is quite common. Survivors are coming with individual stories and situations after they exit trafficking, and many are carrying the weight of these legal consequences through a number of different issues, creating very real obstacles on their way forward, which we went into more in our last presentation. What we want to focus on now more is to emphasize that it's often multiple legal needs. And so at ALIGHT, for example, on average, each survivor that we serve has about 2 different legal needs. But the reality is, while some survivors have only 1 need, we have others with as many as 8 different legal needs. And often these different legal needs are across different legal areas, which means you need a different lawyer for those needs. So one survivor may have criminal records and text issues, which is for which you need 2 different legal expertise. Another survivor may have identity theft and employment issues, which are also completely different areas of expertise. And so because we're dealing with very real people with very real on the ground challenges, we have to be aware that quite a lot of different specializations come into play. Often there's also multi-jurisdictional needs where survivors need help in one or more geographic area, particularly if they were moved by their trafficker. Although movement is not required for trafficking, sometimes it is a reality where they may have been trafficked to different states, or the survivor may have moved away from their trafficker to leave behind or escape for safety, or perhaps even to start over. But at the end of the day, what it means is that they may have needs in multiple locations where obviously they cannot establish residency in multiple locations, which is often required for access to local legal services. One survivor that ALIGHT has worked with actually had criminal records in 36 different states, which means 36 different processes. So this alone is an important dimension to keep track of. And finally, the 4th dimension, which we will go into in detail, is in addition to all of these challenges, survivors also need person-centered and trauma-informed care to ensure that their legal journey and their legal process is supported. And so with the next slide, we will go into the legal needs. And indeed, as I mentioned, survivors of trafficking have vast and varied legal needs. The experience of trafficking itself gives rise to a whole host of issues. The underlying vulnerabilities that may persist or be exacerbated by the trafficking experience. So it's important to understand how survivors often need a continuum of services, including a continuum of legal services, some of which are not always related to the trafficking experience itself, but nevertheless critical to address to ensure that that individual is not vulnerable to continued instability and worst case scenario to re-trafficking. So you see here a list of needs, again, across different areas of law, and we can try to bucket them, even thinking first that there are certain crisis services that survivors need, which are more immediate if they are recently escaping their trafficker or dealing with their safety, if they have to be dealing with law enforcement, somehow participating with the investigation or prosecution of their trafficker, if they are dealing with CPS to gain their children back, if their life is in danger by the trafficker, which we are seeing more and more through ongoing harassment and especially cyber stalking. So those could be much more immediate needs, but there's also sets of legal needs that are more around healing and restoration services, dealing with the fallout of the exploitation. And so survivors may need help with getting pornography off of the internet, taking care of their credit, cleaning up their credit, clearing their name from identity theft. Perhaps even if they were, if they have medical or therapeutic needs as a result of trafficking through which they accumulated a lot of debt, that could be another area. Criminal records is almost its own area of needs because it is a very real barrier to employment and housing and scholarships, as Megan has pointed to, and it is consistently the #1 need that ALIGHT sees and that our partners see. Having most sex trafficking victims are forced or coerced to engage in criminal conduct, in addition to the conduct of the commercial sex. Other offenses that are common that we see are breaking and entering, possession of illegal substances and firearms, and etc. And these criminal records are debilitating to someone who's trying to seek and maintain financial independence. Criminal defense can also come into play, as many survivors may have been forced to plea down because of their public defender or district attorney did not fully understand their circumstances. And so another issue where the survivors are also being treated as the offenders through a trend that we're not happy to see, but we want to make sure to address with this presentation. So with the next slide, Megan will share some interlocking needs and case studies so that this can be grounded in real stories.
Oops, thanks, Marianna. So for those of you that attended our first session, these are going to be a little bit of a recap, but as Marianna just further unpacked some of these situations, I'm going to talk through 3 potential scenarios, and you can see these interlocking issues, and some of them are immediate issues, some of them are longer term issues, all across different types of law. And jurisdictions. So we have Jenny, and Jenny is a survivor who leaves the father of her child, who is her trafficker, and the trafficker pursues custody of the child. The survivor has a history of housing instability and substance use directly related to her trafficking. And so you can hear here that we have definitely some family law needs, but we might also have things around credit history or rental history, and potentially other criminal law that, as Marianna said, perhaps Jenny pled down to something as terms for a reduced sentence relating to the substance use. Then we have Terrence. Terrence is a survivor who leaves his family of origin who trafficked him. And he's seeking independent housing as an adult now. But he discovers after applying for an apartment that his family had opened multiple credit cards in his name, and he's now delinquent on them, but they show up on his credit report. Even though he did not open these, he had no idea that they were there. So Terrence has relocated across the country for safety and doesn't want his family of origin to know where he is currently. So again, as Marianna touched on, just the sensitive nature of a lot of situations that survivors find ourselves in after exit, and needing to stay safe while also addressing these legal needs. And then we have Alex, and Alex did not self-identify as a survivor of trafficking until 11 years post-exit, but they've been working to pay off $300,000 of debt incurred during the trafficking experience over this past decade. So the debt is active on their credit report, yet they're now in a career where they no longer qualify for pro bono legal services. So their income is too high, but they still have this debt that they've been very diligent at working on paying off, but it was such a significant amount that it's something that they're looking at probably paying off the rest of their lives. I'm going to hand it back to you, Marianna.
Yeah, and we're excited about addressing this issue. This is something that came up during questions during the last workshop, and we agree. We think it's incredibly important to address the power dynamics in working with the legal system and working with attorneys specifically. Often survivors report that they have intersected with lawyers in the legal system in a variety of ways that directly harm them, or at the very least sowed deep seeds of distrust. They may have been dealing with lawyers that they were trafficked to, who were their buyers of the illicit sex, or perhaps they were threatened by lawyers who were somehow associated with the trafficker, and part of the dynamic of the trafficker exerting power and control and threats over their victim. If you can imagine the trafficker sharing, this is the money that I have, this is who I know, you can't touch me, look at these bulldog lawyers on my side, no one will believe you. That's a very real experience that we hear from survivors over and over again. Traffickers, lawyers may have also been subsequent exploiters of survivors. So not involved with the initial trafficking experience, but somehow benefiting either from the trafficking experience or from the individual's vulnerability. And here we have a screenshot from an article with a problematic title that I will address, but what this story goes to is a case out of Central Florida last year where an attorney was accused of abusing his position of authority to the extreme. This was someone who was a one-time candidate for the district public defender's office and preyed on his vulnerable clients. He was charged with recruiting through his law firm. So what he would do is target individuals that already had criminal records and were seeking help from a criminal defense attorney, and then initiating the women and the juveniles into commercial sexual exploitation by then charging them and saying, if you can't pay the fees, we will exchange sex acts for legal fees that you would otherwise have to pay me. But that wasn't even the end, because then it would progress. It was truly an initiation process where then he would provide his clients with illegal drugs, post the ads of them online as escorts, arrange for commercial sex dates through his home. All of this was happening for years with a public-facing member of the legal community. And eventually he was convincing someone who ended up being the informant of him to recruit other women and girls. So he was busted for trying to pay $100 for sex with an undercover agent who was posing as a 16-year-old. This is one extreme situation, and the title of this article. It's a very interesting article to see, and even though this article is unearthing this abuse that's happening, this abuse of power, this article, like so many others in the media, unfortunately still tries to connect prostitution with teenagers in commercial sex. And as we know, there's no such thing as a minor prostitute. Minors cannot consent to sexual exploitation. So even this article makes that misrepresentation. However, it does go into this attorney's recruitment strategy. And I think I didn't add this under subsequent exploiters, but we can also add more so-called benign harm by attorneys who just don't believe survivors who turn to them for help. And I know Megan also definitely wants to speak to this topic because we talk about it a lot.
Yes, I was very excited. Again, if you attended our first session right at the very end, we had a question around just the patriarchy and really examining some of the systemic issues that we see that intersect and contribute to exploitation and trafficking in our society. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want to do an entire webinar just on this topic. So we did want to just very briefly address some of this in this part 2 webinar. So these past harms by folks that work within the legal system or the criminal justice system. And I can share just additional firsthand experience with some of these things, and then also some of the research that we've done. So I absolutely had buyers that were attorneys. That is a population that we see that engages in purchasing commercial sex. And we see this in our research. So one of the questions that we ask victims and survivors of trafficking in almost every single interview that we do for whatever project, one of our questions is always, who are your buyers? And most commonly, buyers are people who are middle or upper class, and they're in positions of power. So we've seen lawyers, judges, law enforcement, all of these different professionals are contributing to exploitation. The other place that we see this sometimes is connected with the trafficker. So my second trafficker that I was sold to in Las Vegas, he actually paid our legal fees. He had a lawyer that he worked with specifically. And so he actually took myself and another victim to her office. He paid all of the fees to her. So she was very well aware that we had a pimp, and she knew who he was. They went out to dinner together, and we were told, you know, if you want any level of legal representation, this is the person that you have to go through. So we had a lack of choice in that space of choosing an attorney for ourselves. And I think these are really important to understand, and this is not specific just to the legal system or the criminal justice field. This is in every field and every service within anti-trafficking work. So a lot of times we think that trafficking survivors were kind of starting at like a zero, kind of a neutral place of building trust and rapport and offering services. And the reality is that most of us have experienced severe trauma and relational harm at the hands of the people that are saying that they're going to be helping us. And so as folks that are caring professionals and wanting to do good work, there's unfortunately, as the saying goes, a few, bad apples spoil the whole bunch. So there's individuals that have done these things. Are they the majority? Absolutely not. They are in the minority. But the harm that's been caused has put us at kind of a negative place when it comes to building trust and establishing rapport with somebody, and then being able to offer them support and have them trust us as service providers enough to be able to deliver those services successfully. And so we have to do a lot of repair work for damages that we as individuals didn't do, but it exists, and we have to go above and beyond to build back that trust and get us even up to zero, where survivors are then able to trust and engage with services with us. Marianna, am I leaving anything out on that? Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. And Marianna, I think this is you. Did Marianna drop off?
Hi there. Yes.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
So this is exactly why the legal representation is an important part of the healing process for survivors, and why we focus on changing that dynamic of and being aware that we are counteracting past abuses or past instances of distrust, as Megan has gone through. If I'm trying to find the words of how it's awful to even describe it, but I think if we consider that working with survivors as legal clients, we have to be aware that they may have been in situations where they were given no choice, they were treated as less than, and perhaps they were even treated as things, which is very extreme to even contemplate. And so creating a very healthy and productive and supportive legal relationship is an opportunity to heal that. In any case, the legal journey is often running side by side with the healing journey. And so making a concerted effort to create a different dynamic, we want to focus on person-centered legal care and trauma-informed legal care. Person-centered care really speaks to establishing a relationship with the survivor that promotes their emotional and physical safety and builds trust, having in mind everything that Megan spoke to in terms of past abuses of trust. And trauma-informed care speaks to being aware that you are working with an individual that likely has experienced trauma and may be experiencing symptoms and risk of exacerbated trauma in the process of working with them. And so having that awareness, recognition, and tools to respond in the situation is an important component of legal representation. There was a great article that just came out from the American Bar Association from the Legal Burnout Solution with specific strategies for trauma-informed practice. And then we also have resources that speak to that. And so with the next slide, the research from this survey and the Legal Deserts report reiterates the importance of survivor-centered and trauma-informed care. The Survivor Speaks survey was a survey by the National Survivor Law Collective, which I will explain in a further slide, which conducted a survey with 35 survivor leaders across the US about the impact of COVID on their lives and their experience of working and seeking legal services. And the responses were very stark. Some survivors reported being treated as subhuman by their attorneys, while others reported being treated with dignity and respect. And so evidently this is a very uneven and unfair experience with legal assistance that we have in the US in this day and age. This survey is provided in the handout materials as well, and it contains both qualitative and quantitative information. Survivors shared a range of experiences when trying to access legal help, both for themselves and trying to assist other survivors' efforts. Of the 35 respondents who spoke to personally seeking to access legal help, 36% had a positive experience, 46% had neutral or did not disclose their experience, and 18% had negative experience. And of the 35 respondents who shared their insights and other survivors' experience with accessing legal help, 37% indicated that other survivors had challenges finding legal help. I also wanted to make sure to include this word cloud, which for me was one of the most interesting parts of the study, where we asked the respondents to comment on the qualities in lawyers that they most value. And you will see that honesty hit it right out of the park. So I find that a very important marker that we bring to the attorneys that we work with, and very important piece of feedback. The next slide speaks to the Legal Deserts Report, which was a study put out by the Avery Center and again the National Survivor Law Collective of 550 organizations in the US that advertise their legal resources services. The amazing team at Avery Center conducted multiple outreach over multiple months, over multiple means of communication to try to elicit a response from these organizations. And in addition to the gaps in legal services that we dove into with our last presentation, we also want to speak to the important commentary on the quality of care and insights around that. And so I know Megan has 2 points that she wants to reveal and elicit from the report.
Yeah, so strongly encourage you to go read the full Legal Deserts report, because there's so much good, helpful information and insights in it. I do want to just talk about the importance of trauma-informed care, and again, going back to understanding some of the historical trauma that survivors of human trafficking have experience with the criminal justice system, and then also just with accessing legal services or interacting with professionals in those fields. So one of my favorite quotes is by a fellow survivor leader, Avery Lloyd, and she says that our exploitation and harm happened within the context of relationships, so too must our healing. And I think this just kind of summarizes what trauma-informed care can look like, and what Marianna was talking about with accessing legal services is a part of our healing process, in that it helps to resolve issues that were either made us vulnerable to exploitation in the first place, or were part of our trafficking experience directly, but it also repairs the relationships that were harmed during those experiences too, and shows us that there are people out there who are trustworthy and are able to follow through on their word and value us as humans and as individuals that deserve equal access to basic needs and healthy relationships. So the second piece is this victim-offender dynamic. And so Dr. Angie Henderson from the University of Northern Colorado has a piece coming out in the Journal of Human Trafficking about the victim-offender overlap and what that is like for individuals who specifically how they interact with the criminal justice system. So within sex trafficking operations, oftentimes there are victims who sometimes are referred to as bottoms, or the bottom girl. So this is the individual that is kind of middle management within a trafficking operation, but all of the legal liability the trafficker places on this individual. And so if there's an investigation, for example, what the evidence that's going to show up, the actual concrete evidence, is going to be the bottom that's placing the phone calls, the bottom that is transporting the other victims, the bottom that is depositing or withdrawing money from bank accounts. And so from that perspective, a lot of times this victim actually ends up being criminalized as in like a co-conspirator or a co-trafficking situation. And the reality is that dynamic is very unique, and it's not as black and white as we would like it to be. It's very nuanced. So that, again, that journal article should be coming out early 2022, but also very important to understand that component. It's just one of many ways survivors of human trafficking see themselves on the side in the criminal justice system being criminalized for our victimization. And I am going to talk again a little bit about the Legal Deserts report and some of our findings that were really important to understand. So direct legal representation is ultimately concentrated in high density urban areas. And so while we were thinking of this concept of legal deserts, similar to the concept of like food deserts, we were not realizing that essentially most of the United States is a legal desert. So this geographic mapping of legal services was very eye-opening at the end of the day. When we surveyed all these 550 organizations, not many of them actually even responded to these multiple attempts by the Avery Center's team to answer our survey questions or have a conversation with somebody from our research team. Of the ones that did, about a third of the responding organizations only serve individuals who have immigration issues or who have experienced international trafficking. However, they're not able to provide assistance to domestic survivors. So again, a very large gap in legal services that are available for human trafficking survivors here domestically. Another third of the responding organizations worked in parallel movements, so domestic violence, sexual assault, or gender-based violence. And as a result, they're either limited, invisible, or exclusive of male survivors, just because of the fields that they're situated in and the gendered component of those fields. So those are some of like the unfortunate pieces that are in this report, but not everything is bad. So I want to end kind of on a more promising note before I hand things back to Marianna. So not everything was bad in this report. The most encouraging thing is that the orgs that did respond and are truly offering direct legal representation, they're very dedicated, passionate, and oftentimes very successful in their work. And there's a growing trend of private law firms providing pro bono assistance to survivors through connecting organizations such as ALIGHT. And that's great news. We just need more of that.
Well, I am very excited to read Dr. Henderson's report, and I have to laugh because, as you could tell from this presentation, Megan and I love to give resources and research, and there's always more, even besides what's in the handouts. And I think part of that is Megan's philosophy that services and solutions really have to be grounded in research, and so her organization specifically focuses on that. These are some of the recommendations that came through the Legal Deserts report, and they're a starting place that the National Survivor Law Collective will be using to convene a number of stakeholders to discuss how do we start filling these legal deserts. And as we've talked about today, the recommendations parallel some of these points, including the fact that different types of needs are needed, multi-jurisdictional needs must be addressed. We see a great deal in our work, a high demand in addition to help with criminal records, family law issues, but also truly the full range of legal needs.
Sorry, Marianna, I'm struggling with my buttons.
Oh, no worries.
Are you ready for me?
Yes.
Okay. So some of the other recommendations, just continuing on what Marianna talked about, really this need for a national infrastructure. So what we've seen is over this last year, especially with COVID, scaling nationally, but not really having the full infrastructure built out. So what we've experienced as the Avery Center is we do national outreach, and so we have folks that need legal services in a specific city, and we don't have anybody yet. And so that's really, we should be going the other way about things, if that makes sense. So we should have those legal services in place. We should know who's there. Those folks should be trained and ready to start supporting survivors with addressing their legal needs. But it's very reactionary right now in addressing the demand for legal services for survivors. We are working on some of this through social media presence that the Avery Center has within the community of folks who are experiencing commercial sexual exploitation. I'm watching the clock right now, so I want to be mindful of time, but you can go read more on the Avery Center's website about that social media presence and what we do with it. But one of the things that we're looking at is really honing in on locations of people across the country so that we can start targeting those areas and reaching out and making sure that we have a service infrastructure built out so that when we start doing really intentional outreach to those communities, we already have services to get them plugged in with.
Great. And I think in the interest of time, we can go through the next 4 slides pretty quickly, especially some of it repeats the material from the first workshop. This is a slide about ALIGHT's work as we are trying to fill out that national infrastructure that is needed. Of course, we can't do it alone, but we've been coming in to try to fill in the gaps because this is a dire need, and we have to be in a completely different place where when a survivor reaches out for help, we have to have something to offer them. And at the same time, something that I notice is awareness campaigns and a lot of conversations about human trafficking. And I'm a firm believer that you really do have to have those resources already in place, because if you're starting the conversation, but you're not able to offer tangible help, that could even create further distrust. And so this is definitely part of our mission, building a national legal network. With the next slide, this is again information for how attorneys can join us. We are certainly looking for attorneys across all the different jurisdictions, across all areas of law other than immigration, and that is because immigration tends to be covered by local services. But what we really need are attorneys to help with criminal records and family law and benefits, intellectual property, debtors' rights, all kinds of issues. And so do please reach out through that expression of interest, and we can get you started and tell you more about our program to see if you can join. And I believe, oh, thank you so much. Steve has dropped in that link for how to reach out to us. And on the flip side, with the next slide, we have information for survivors who are trying to reach attorneys through our national network. And so please do feel free to share our information, and we will do the best we can. There's also one of the handouts, survivor cards with the basic information about the types of issues that we cover. Again, we don't work on some of the issues, but we really try as much as we can to fill in those gaps in nuts and bolts legal issues. And so finally, with the next slide on resources, this again reiterates some of the handouts that may be helpful to share with survivors themselves to support them and prepare them for working with attorneys. So I think with that, with all these resources, they will be in your handout section. The great team will be following up with other materials to those who have signed up for this webinar. So you will be well resourced with all our information that as you know, we love and we focus on. And so I think we're ready for Q&A, and I'm curious what may be coming in.
Great, thanks so much, Marianna. I really especially appreciate this last slide, which just shows how survivor-centered you all truly are, that when you're thinking about legal resources for survivors, you're thinking about it from the survivor perspective always, and from the very beginning to end, and I really appreciate that so much. So yeah, as folks are mulling over the content that you've heard over the last 55 minutes or so, please put in your questions to the questions section on the tab on the right-hand side of your screen. We did get one question from Joshua, who asked, Megan, could you repeat that quote about relationships that I think it was Aubrey Lloyd who you were quoting as having said?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, credit goes to Aubrey Lloyd. And she said, our exploitation happened within the context of relationships, so too must our healing.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Megan. I had a question for you both as folks are putting their questions in the question box. What surprised you most in the process of doing the research for the Legal Deserts report?
I could start, and I think we both often talk to each other about how are there 550 organizations that are listed and public about offering legal services to survivors, when in fact they're not responsive to multiple attempts, especially over the course of last year. And it's very, very misleading, and I think very difficult from the survivor's point of view, which I know Megan can definitely speak more to the process of her team even reaching out for information back from these organizations. But for me, the starkest number was that there are 550 organizations claiming to do this, when we know the reality is that survivors rarely have any free, flexible, trauma-informed, inclusive, supportive, free legal services to turn to.
Yeah, I would echo Marianna and say I think that was definitely the most surprising finding for me too, was like 550 organizations somehow say they do legal services. And so couple things that were surprising about that. Not surprising, I would say more validating than anything as a survivor, having reached out for services over the years for myself to a wide variety of organizations for different things. And feeling like I didn't get a call back, or I didn't qualify for services, or I had to go through this elaborate intake process only to be told that they didn't have the services that I was actually looking for. And so the research project ended up being kind of an exercise in empathy building for our research team, which was validating for me as a survivor to hear, unfortunately. Our research team feeling so defeated and like deflated of, I've called this place 3 times, I've left messages, and if we're experiencing this and we're just, we're trying to collect data and find out more, but how does it feel to a survivor who's maybe reaching out and trying to advocate for themselves, and they're being met with just absolute silence? So I think that was one of my biggest takeaways from that. And then as a direct service provider, it also made me think, and I talked with Marianna about this, we oftentimes get sent surveys, or we're on different resource lists that ask what services we offer. And certain things like legal services, I always hesitate, like, do we check this box? Because the Avery Center does not offer legal services, but we are a referral partner for legal services to ALIGHT. And we also, our service team can go sit in court with folks, but we can't directly represent folks. And so some of that nuance, I think, as service providers, we just need to be more aware of how that plays out kind of in the macro, and the experiences of people that are trying to access these services, and contacting agencies that don't offer legal services but have checked that box in whatever survey for whatever reason.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Megan and Marianna, for both this webinar and the previous one. For anyone who missed the previous webinar, please feel free to check out the recording of that webinar. At the end, when you log out of this presentation, you'll be asked to fill out an evaluation. Please do fill that out and give us your feedback. We very much appreciate hearing from you. Thank you all so much for taking the time to attend today. Please do read the Legal Deserts report, and thank you so much, and have a good day.
Thank you. Take care.